Welcome to the Robotics Through Science Fiction podcast. Today's podcast is about Isaac Asimov, and I have here Joanne Pransky, an editor of Industrial Robot Journal, creator of the Essential interview on LinkedIn, and the world's first robotic psychiatrist. So, Joanne, thanks for being with us today. What do you do as the world's first robotic psychiatrist?
Well, I mostly wait for patients like Dolores from Westworld, where she can come in my office and we can have a conversation. I can help her. Hashtag robots, me too. So I've waited for what Asimov predicted would be when robots and humans converse, and Susan Cavill would come in and diagnose them and see where they're not adhering to the three laws of robotics. But of course, this was 32 years ago that I built myself the world's first robotic psychiatrist. So it hasn't exactly, I'm a little bit ahead of my time. Hopefully I'm still be known, more post-singularity than posthumously. But so for my lifetime, I was always interested in HOS, the human operating system. And in the mid-'80s, I was selling computers, and I realized that we as a society, particularly in the United States, we were not ready for the social, emotional, and psychological effects of the rate of technology. So I humorously, tongue-in-cheek, built myself as the world's first robotic psychiatrist, and it was several reasons I did that. Number one, I believed that awareness leads to acceptance. And if we didn't know what a robot was, the average person, the National Enquirer reading group, which I always told IEEE engineers, make sure on your way out, get the National Enquirer, that's in the early 90s, because that's how the average American thinks. So awareness leads to acceptance. So my big issue over the past 32 years is make them aware by bringing real robots onto national television, late night, and I've had a few successes at that. I brought androids onto Jimmy Kimmel, and I was a judge on Comedy Central's BattleBots, and I had the opportunity to consult for Ender's Game by bringing we got real users of exoskeletons around the world onto the set. Not just fabricated, not just the robots itself, but robots. And so, when you see it, it's like an animal on Johnny Carson in the 60s. Or when you see a robot in real time, you see not only what it does, but what it can't do. And that, to me, is the biggest thing towards awareness. So Susan Calvin and robopsychology, but the world is not quite ready. And if you ask them, well, the general perception is, well, I fear robots. And, well, have you ever worked with one? Have you ever seen one? So our society, particularly in the U.S., has not done that. So my journey, is the 13 minutes up yet? Because I know I'm almost there, right? So my journey has been to prepare the world for the future of robotics by using this tongue-in-cheek approach to create awareness, also bridging the gap between the users and the brilliant engineering world, and also, if you will, to maybe diminish the Frankenstein complex, the view that mechanical beings would destroy humanity.
Yeah, well, that's I always love those robot uprising stories there. But you mentioned Susan Calvin, and so we're going to circle back to that, because wasn't the first robotic robot psychiatrist Dr. Susan Calvin and Asimov's iRobot series of stories? I mean,
she was. Dr. Susan Calvin was a robo-psychologist, and he created her in 1950 in his stories, iRobot, and she was a robo-psychologist that was a brilliant female that was trained in cybernetics and robotics, but also understood the human side. And so I just made it more of a modern twist for the 80s when I started this by saying, like a pet psychiatrist or a child psychiatrist, it's really not the child or pet that always has a behavior problem. It's kind of like the adults it engages with. And so I just took up robotic psychology and I made it into more of a modern robotic psychiatrist, hoping I get paid more, but that hasn't been the case since. And then I got the opportunity to meet, I engrossed myself in everything from real world robotics. I sold industrial robots for 10 years, but when I started out, I was getting my hands on every robot movie, every science fiction book I could about robotics, as well as going to the International Robots and Vision show. So combining the two worlds of real and science fiction. I met Isaac Asimov at the World Science Fiction Convention in Boston in 1989. Of course, he had a fear of flying, but he lived in New York, so somehow was able to get there quickly. And I literally ran through there just bowling everyone over. I'm Susan Calvin. So I was delighted to meet him. He dubbed me the real Susan Calvin in '89. He wrote it to me, and we ended up corresponding until he was very, very ill, which was about 1990, prior to his death in '92.
So let's talk about Asimov's legacy. I mean, that'll be one of the disappointments of my life that I never got to meet the good doctor. But in particular, how do you think he shaped, or his legacy has shaped, the field of robotics?
Well, I think his legacy is everything. And let me just say, while you were busy trying to find robots to solve the world's problems, he would have absolutely loved you. And that's why you didn't get the chance to meet him, because I was flocking to world science fiction conventions trying to find a role in the world. He is really the pioneer to me of, well, first of all, he coined the word robotics, the study of robots. He also created the 4 laws, the 3 laws plus the 0th law, that you must protect humanity. And I think even though he wasn't as a chemist, as a PhD in chemistry, I don't think it was his claim to fame became these 3 laws of robotics, that it was the greatest contribution to science fiction. And I think, like science fiction, you don't know if it's a chicken or the egg. In other words, do roboticists like you, and Joseph Engelberger, the founding father of the industrial robot, and Rodney Brooks and Helen Greiner, who was significantly impacted by Star Wars. She was one of the co-founders of the company iRobot. So do you read about this? I mean, obviously you didn't have any visuals, so this is all, you didn't have any pictures. No one told you what a humanoid robot was in his book. So did you take his benevolent view of robots used as tools, and the first to be our friends, our companions, our colleagues, our co-workers, and did you try as a roboticist make this happen, or I don't know which came first, but I think he is really truly the originator, and still is. Unfortunately, a lot of this generation hasn't heard of Isaac Asimov, but they know. I mean, and he didn't understand the practical robot. He never saw the practical robotics. I mean, the guy still typed on a typewriter, I think, even until maybe a word processor beginning in 1990 or 89. But I mean, he just clearly, though, understood the future. And it's almost like Einstein said, imagination is more important than knowledge. And I think that he knew that about robotics, being able to be the tools that should do all the drudgery, while we humans can perhaps enjoy a renaissance period of intellectualism and doing what we do best.
Yeah, Asimov's vision, he was such a humanist. One of the things I love about the robot stories is that there was never any robot uprising. There was never any bad use of robots. And he truly believed that humans can and should be ethical and work for the greater good. How do you see that playing out in his robot stories?
Well, it became so fascinating with his 3 laws. That became the crux of every story. And there's so many gray areas. I mean, in Liar, if I tell a lie, if I tell you that I think you're the most incredible child in the whole wide world, and you're really not, I mean, at what point do you lie to protect a human from coming to harm? Is that going to be harmful if I lie to you? Or and it just went on and intricate, and even as the reader, you don't always know where he's going or the ending. The guy was amazing. So even something small like that weak and runaround, the weak second law, and the strong 3rd law. Well, I can see a robot just shutting down because it can't go any further. But you know what? Then you say, well, you know what? There's a fire. Go save that robot. And go save that human, and that supersedes everything else. So it just was so intricate, and I don't think he realized that 50 years of his writing it. I mean, he was 19 when he created. He thought about it, but to him it was just very simple. Robots are tools, and they have to be safe, and everything else was based on the 4 laws of robotics, and every story was fascinating about that.
So let's return back to Susan Calvin. So Dr. Susan Calvin was everything my mom was worried about that I'd become that stereotype of going into science. She was professionally at the top of her game, but she didn't have a family. She didn't have any friends. She wasn't actually that likable per se. And I've never been able to reconcile that with Asimov's humanism because he's so pro-people. And now even more seeing he say that you're the real Susan Calvin, and I know you're not that whole stereotypical, type that.
Well, that is very kind. And I mean, first of all, my personal theory is that he actually, besides writing, his love of writing was number one, and I think his number two love was women. And I think if he knew that you're such an attractive woman and that a roboticist like a female could be attractive, I don't think that he would have been able to write about her as much and to focus on her. And I don't think
being a roboticist, it would have been all about being the woman, right?
Right, and yet at the same time, he specifically made the chief robopsychologist a woman because he knew that a woman had feminine intuition. He even wrote a story about that. He knew that women were sensitive to human needs as well as to robotic needs. He also made Susan Calvin that way because if she had a family, she wasn't going to treat her patients as her children. So I think it was really, I mean, she certainly did not look like Bridget Moynihan of iRobot. So, I mean, and Calvin and I were both graying, and I'm certainly getting older, although Susan Calvin did not live, I don't think, more than 82. But I think it's just the way it was. It had nothing to do with that. I mean, it's really unfortunate that any female scientist or roboticist would say, oh, you must have to be lonely, or you have to be a geek, or you have to be stereotypical. I don't think he intended that. I personally really think that he loved women so much that if she had even an air of attractiveness to her, that he would not have been able to see her as this scientist that's solving all the problems of U.S. mechanical men and U.S. Robotics and Mechanical Men, Inc. So I think that he would have just been enamored that you have taken your life and dedicated it to having robots in disasters and solving, you really put that zeroth law that robots need to protect against, humanity and not allow humanity to come to harm. And that's what you dedicated your life. He would be just thrilled.
Well, thank you. And I do think that, I really appreciate your comments because that's always been a gap for me. But also, Asimov wrote a lot of really great women characters, too. I mean, I just loved our Katie Darnell. Daryl as growing up. I mean, the mouthy little 14-year-old is like, yay team, I'm on her side.
He always had not only great view of robots' uses, but he happened to have this subconscious great view of women. I mean, even in his stories, it was in Bicentennial Man, I mean, it was Miss whatever her, it was Little Miss that was the Pearl, or Gloria, and it was always that, that male, it was the male robot and that female relationship that he just thought women are really, really special and unusually talented in the emotional IQ and social IQ and intuitive about it. And that's why they would be the best people to solve the problems of robots in society.
Well, I think so. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but let me ask you just one quick question. If you had to name one Asimov book or story, and no cheating, saying The Complete Robot, okay, for people to read about robots, which one would you recommend?
Well, iRobot, and also Robot Visions, which he published in 1990, because at the end of the book, besides some of the stories he also republished from iRobot, are essays about snippets on why he created robots and the technology that he created in these essays and that he mentioned. There's GPS, there's internet, there's telerobotics, there's brain-computer interface, and you get to see his thinking behind all of these stories that he created, and he mentions that. So, but of course, I have to also say his first story, Robbie, was my first story that I read by him, and so here I was 40 years ago, whatever, reading Robbie, and Gloria, and that relationship about this little girl that never gets over the loss of that. And I'm thinking, what happens when she comes home and wants to marry him? So these are some of the futuristic thoughts I had. I mean, we can't even, how are we going to get it right between humans? We don't even, gay marriage, that's an issue one day, like Gloria would say. I mean, I want to marry my robot. So that was my favorite story, even though the robot didn't speak.
Well, thank you very much. It's a delight to have you, Joanne, and we hope to have you back. And that concludes this episode of our podcast, Robotics Through Science Fiction.